Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Hi, this is Kurt Repanshek, your host at National Parks Traveler. How are Venezuela's national parks faring during these days of political and human strife in that country? Kim O'Connell provided an update with her insightful feature on the Traveler last week. Readers also learned about efforts to rehabilitate the Tidal Basin on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and about road work needed to reopen the eastern entrance to Zion National Park. You can find those and other stories about national parks at nationalparkstraveler.org. In this week's show, Dan Wenk, who retired last fall from the National Park Service after more than 4 decades working for the agency, shares his views on the current state of that venerable agency. We also have a short interview with Katherine Malone-France of the National Trust for Historic Preservation on efforts to chart a much-needed restoration of the Tidal Basin at the National Mall. Erika Zambello concludes this episode with her reflections from a visit to Little River Canyon National Preserve in Alabama. Dan Wenk spent more than 4 decades working for the National Park Service. Though he started out as a landscape architect, he rose to deputy director of the agency and even interim CEO of the National Park Foundation before settling back at Yellowstone National Park as superintendent. Last fall, rather than taking a forced assignment back in Washington, D.C., Wenk decided to retire after 8 years in Yellowstone. Since then, he's watched the National Park Service drift without a permanent director at the helm, and as the Trump administration tried to keep national parks open and functioning normally during the partial government shutdown. The other day, we reached out to Wenk to get his thoughts on his beloved agency. Hi, Dan. How are you today? Thanks for joining us.
Well, doing well. It's a great day to be looking out the window at it raining and snowing.
Yeah, well, it is getting to be mud season in the Rockies, so I guess we shouldn't be too surprised.
No.
Now, you've been, quote-unquote, retired, so to speak, since last fall. Just kind of curious what you've been working on or how you've been spending those months away from a full-time job.
Well, it has been just about 6 months, and in that 6 months, it's when you retire from the National Park Service, when you're living in a national park, not only do you retire and walk out the office, but you also have to relocate a household. So we moved to Rapid City, South Dakota, where we have 2 of our children and our grandchildren live, and we've been trying to settle into our home, and then we're doing a little bit of travel, not as much as we hope to do in the future, but and also doing some lectures in different places around the country about things that are important to us in terms of whether it be wildlife or whether it be the things that are facing the national parks as we move forward, and talking to some folks about opportunities to continue to contribute.
It sounds like you're just as busy as you were before.
Well, certainly I'm not. I'm also able to go to the local coffee shop in the morning and grab a cup of coffee, read the newspaper read the news on the internet at a little more leisurely pace. Certainly, it's a more relaxed time than it was previously.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's been an interesting time with the current administration, and certainly every administration, whichever party, Democrat, Republican, there's always going to be some particular currents that flow through that the administration wants to see integrated across the country. Should we be surprised at all by the current state of affairs with the Park Service specifically?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. I think there's ebbs and flows to an administration that's come in. I've been sort of at since the Bush II administration, I've really been was in leadership positions within the National Park Service, and you see administrations exit, and you see what the emphasis that they place on their last years of administration, and you see administrations come in, and the emphasis that they want to place on what they're doing, and it's in some ways predictable in terms of how they deal with things like regulation and policies of the National Park Service, and so I think career employees of the Park Service sort of get ready for it. And that's not in a negative sense for either administration. It's getting ready for it in terms of trying to anticipate the kinds of things that they'll be asked to address and to look at as they move forward. It's, I think some administrations, the pendulum swings a little bit farther in each direction, but it's predictable.
Yeah. Now, I've always thought that the National Park Service was in place to protect and preserve these incredible places, whether it's a cultural site or a scenic vista park or geothermal at Yellowstone, that they were supposed to protect and preserve these places for the American public, for today's generations and tomorrow's generations. And yet we see, administrations come in and kind of guide the Park Service in a specific direction. Am I being too idealistic in my expectations, what I have for the Park Service?
No, I think one of the things that we always have is we can rely on law, regulation, and policy. I think the law rarely changes. And I think the bottom line of the law, we are here to protect unimpaired for future generations the resources of the National Park Service, and while providing for visitor use. The question is, and that gets down to regulation and policy, is how you divide between the protection of those resources and appropriate visitor use, of the resources. And I think every administration probably has a little bit different view of what how those values in conflict are. How they view what should be the preeminent value. My personal belief is that Congress made it very clear in 1978 under the Redwoods Act that the preeminent value when those two things come into conflict is the preservation of resources. But every administration, I think, pushes the lines in both directions.
I guess one of those lines was just recently pushed during the partial government shutdown when the administration wanted to keep the national parks open with what's been described as a skeleton workforce.
Yes, it really was. I mean, previous to that, with the exception of the first shutdown in this administration, there was the same attempt to keep it open for visitor use. The difference was it lasted 2 days, and I can't remember the exact number, 1 to 3 days versus 35 days, and what that really meant and what it looked like. Unfortunately, we've all been through many shutdowns. Some of the last ones, even in the Obama administration, there were a time frame of 1 to 3 days to close parks down, to get people out of lodging facilities, for concessionaire lodging facilities, et cetera, and to have an orderly shutdown of the facility. And then literally a skeleton crew in order to provide the protection that park needed to perhaps maintain the operation of water and wastewater, because you still have employees living in the park, to make sure that you had crews in there for fire protection, et cetera, and also you had to man the gates. The latest rendition of a shutdown was one where they were asking skeleton crews to still provide the necessary law enforcement to protect the park, which was difficult, if not impossible, in some places. And then they were asking others, whether it be concessioners or donated dollars, to keep operating facilities. And that had, as we saw, there was resource problems. There were also, in terms of people abusing the resources within parks, there were also law enforcement issues. And I think many of us believe there were going to be safety issues, which there were. Other things that were unacceptable impacts to parks or potential impacts to parks and to people.
Now, I'm wondering, the most egregious example that came to our attention was in Joshua Tree National Park, where people were driving off road. There was at least one Joshua tree cut down. Have you heard of anything similar or just as egregious elsewhere through your sources in the park system?
I'm aware, and unfortunately, I'm not aware. I can't remember right now if it was actually in this shutdown, or if it was the previous one, where, for example, I think it may have been the previous one, where someone at Old Faithful literally took their snowmobile from the parking area and took it around to between the Old Faithful Visitor Center and and Old Faithful Geyser. Yeah, I'm aware of people getting themselves into predicaments where they needed to be helped, if you will, and providing resources to go in and to provide the assistance that they needed takes more time. I don't think there was anything that you could point to that said, well, because we didn't have the resources and it took us 30 minutes or 40 minutes longer to get there, that there was some additional negative consequence. But I think there's probably examples throughout the parks that I don't have all of them where there was behaviors that certainly didn't rise to the level of what happened at Joshua Tree. That behaviors, though, that were inappropriate. And the situation is one where I believe that if it were to continue, or if it was seen as a success, unfortunately, it's a short-term success. If it would be repeated often, I think people would become more bold in terms of what they were doing and the kind of actions they were taking, because they would see the consequences as being very minimal, or things that they would not be known in terms to the National Park Service, to others, that they had done these things. And the long-term effect of that, I think, is extremely negative.
We've been talking with Dan Wenk, who spent a 4-decade career with the National Park Service. His most recent role before retiring in the fall of 2018 was Superintendent of Yellowstone National Park. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy Traveler's content, please consider a donation via nationalparkstraveler.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the National Park System for decades to come. See their successes at www.gtnpf.org. The Yosemite Conservancy inspires people to support projects and programs that preserve Yosemite National Park and enrich the visitor experience. The Conservancy funds transformative work throughout the park. The grants donors support help protect diverse wildlife and plant species and restore the precious habitats they depend on. Grants also support improvements to miles of trails to ensure visitors can safely access Yosemite's wonders. Visit yosemiteconservancy.org to find more inspiration.
The National Park Service employee morale has, in recent years, been an issue. It's always in the federal Best Places to Work survey seems to be near the bottom. Recently, under the current administration, we've got key vacancies from the director of the National Park Service. We don't have a permanent director confirmed by the Senate, to vacancies at the Midwest, Intermountain, and National Capital regions. Do those vacancies impact morale, or do they should they concern us in terms of the day-to-day operation of the Park Service?
I think they certainly impact the morale. I think that certainly we have very competent, good, highly qualified professionals that are in those positions as acting. But I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is what that says by keeping those vacancies to the employees of the National Park Service. I think the question is where does the administration, what kind of value does the administration have that they would allow a directorship of the National Park Service to go without a Senate-confirmed director for over 2 years, that they would allow not to have senior leadership in place within the National Park Service. And so I think it's an overall effect where the question, I think, is raised by employees of how are we valued as an agency, in an organization? How's our mission valued if those positions are left vacant? So I think it does have an overall effect on the morale of the National Park Service. And I think the circumstances, frankly, that many of those vacancies occurred where I think people questioned the value that was placed on the professionalism of individuals that were in some of those positions that have now left is also, a question that's raised by employees of the Park Service.
To your point there, we just lost another key superintendent in the National Park Service, Christine Leonards, basically walked away after a situation at Grand Canyon where a whistleblower made allegations against her, claiming that she had created a hostile workforce. The Office of Inspector General at the Interior Department investigated that and found the charges completely unfounded, cleared her of everything, and she was welcomed back to Grand Canyon National Park. And yet she decided that the situation wasn't comfortable for her to succeed in her role because the whistleblower was still there. What signal does that send to superintendents elsewhere across the system and to those employees who thought that the superintendent, Leonards, was doing a great job?
Well, I think I need to talk about this in general and not about Chris Leonard's case specifically, because I don't know all the facts and I don't know all the issues. But I think you cite a very important thing, and that is where we are in the whole issue. And obviously, the workplace environment throughout the National Park Service has been a issue of focus for a number of years. And it should be an issue of focus, and people deserve a place to work that's safe and free from harassment of any kind. And so it is our obligation to make sure that we have that kind of a workplace within the federal government, in the National Park Service. I think the message that's being sent right now in terms of how we're approaching problems of charges of a hostile work environment, for example, within the workforce, is makes it very difficult for supervisors to have to take actions. It makes it very difficult for them to take actions and feel like they're going to be supported in their actions throughout the line. I think the supervisors have a high desire to make sure that they take the actions they need to take to create the kind of environment that we all deserve to work in. But there are examples throughout the service that when a supervisor does take an action, when there is a claim of inappropriate actions by a supervisor, that we move the supervisor out of the situation and we investigate, whether it be at the level you're talking about with Chris Leonards or whether it be at a much lower level within the organization. Depending on the outcome of that, and we may have situations where the supervisor has done things wrong, and we need to take appropriate actions to deal with them. But where an employee basically has the ability to dictate the terms of what happens with their supervisor, I think it's wrong. Maybe we weren't taking the actions we needed to take quickly enough throughout the service, but we put supervisors and employees in a situation where how does a supervisor come back after they're exonerated and deal with an employee who still is in that workplace and assume for a second that employee may need to have disciplinary action taken for future actions that they do or things that they don't do or their behaviors haven't changed. Every supervisor is going to think twice about it because of things like what happened to Chris Leonards in terms of being removed from her position for 5 months. And I think it's a very difficult position. I don't know what the answer is, Kurt, but I think there has to be a better way to ensure that we have the workplace that people deserve and that we're doing the right things, and at the same time that we find a way to hold supervisors or fellow employees accountable for their actions in the workplace without creating an environment of incredible distrust and incredible, I think, hesitation on the part of supervisors and employees to bring things forward. I don't think it's working the way it is going right now.
No, it's certainly a tough challenge. I was reading a case study the other week where a new CEO came into a company and did not like the culture and thought it was damaging the company's reputation. And basically, he turned over the entire workforce. And of course, it's one thing to do that with a small company. It's another thing when you've got 20,000 employees working for the National Park Service. How you go about addressing those issues is a challenge that's difficult, obviously.
Well, I think I'm not trying to blame the federal employment system here, but I've only had one opportunity in my 40-year career where I went into a position, and when I was manager of the Denver Service Center. When I went into the position, and virtually I was able to select every senior manager with one exception within the first year of my time in that position. I used to, and it was an office that I think is a highly productive. It's a great office now, but it was going through some challenges at the time, and I cannot imagine that a board of directors of a corporation in America that would bring in a new CEO, and say, we want you to change the culture of this organization. We want you to make this a more highly productive, but, oh, by the way, we're not going to let you change your senior leadership. When you look at the National Park Service, whether it's a director coming into the Washington office, or whether it's a regional director coming into a regional office, or a park superintendent coming into a park area, rarely, if ever, does that individual get a chance to put the management team in place that they want. It takes time, it takes attrition, and those things oftentimes, I think, lead to perpetuation of the status quo more so than the kind of changes that different places, different organizations or sub-organizations need and are recognized that are needed by the managers.
Yeah. Do you have any concerns that long-lasting damage is being done to the park system or the park service under the current way things are being managed? And if so, what specifically worries you?
I do have concerns that we are not doing the kind of things that we need to do to take the National Park Service successfully into the next century. And I think that concerns comes from almost a fear of what our actions are going to mean and how those actions are going to be seen. And we're not managing from a position, managers aren't managing from a position of strength at this time, because I don't know that we feel like we're being supported at the highest levels of the organization. And until we get a new director in there, until that new director sets the tone for expectations, all we're seeing is sort of as a perpetuation of the status quo. And the status quo hasn't been working. So I think there's a lot of things that do depend on the new director and the tone that they set at the top.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there today, Dan. Certainly appreciate you making time out. We've been talking with Dan Wenk, a long-term employee of the National Park Service from the field ranks all the way up to the top office in Washington, D.C. He retired last fall from Yellowstone National Park. Dan, we'll have to catch up with you later down the road. There's many more issues and topics in the Park Service we can enjoy talking about.
I would enjoy the opportunity. Thank you, Kurt.
Dude ranches have been showcasing Western landscapes and national parks and their associated experiences for generations of families, many who come back year after year after year to relive the experience. And why not? These typically week-long vacations revolve around trail rides that carry you into these marvelous settings. This Western industry literally grew up with the national park system. There are ranches out there that relish and promote their proximity to national parks. Ranches nearby to Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks in Wyoming, or that sidle up to Saguaro National Park in Arizona. When considering a Dude Ranch vacation, be sure to look for the establishment's endorsement from the Dude Ranchers Association. This organization doesn't take membership lightly. Ranches are evaluated for 2 years on everything from their lodgings to how they care for their horses before they're granted membership. Today, only about 100 ranches have qualified for that distinction. The Dude Ranchers Association. Check it out at duderanch.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org.
The maintenance backlog in the national park system is well known. At nearly $12 billion, it reaches into just about every one of the 418 units of the national park system. Overdue maintenance work stands out at the National Mall and Memorial Parks in Washington, D.C. In the tidal basin of that area, seawaters slowly creep up and cover sidewalks with the tides, and there are places where the seawall is crumbling. Retaining walls are in need of repair, and roots of some of the famed cherry trees need better care. With that understood, a campaign is launched to come up with a creative and long-lasting blueprint for restoring the tidal basin. We caught up the other day with Katherine Malone-France of the National Trust for Historic Preservation to discuss that effort, known as the Ideas Lab, a think tank approach to rehabilitating the iconic basin. Among our questions was whether this philanthropic effort might convince Congress that private dollars, not more federal appropriations, can be used to tackle the maintenance needs of the park system.
Well, I don't think that that's the plan at all. I mean, at this point, I think the private philanthropy is, supporting the Ideas Lab. And then, again, it's not a design competition. It's an Ideas Lab where we'll have a small number of teams that include landscape architects, engineers, and others looking, again, holistically at all of the threats that face the tidal basin. And then, with the very full support of the National Park Service, then providing them with all of those ideas so that they can then initiate their process, which, as you know, includes environmental review, master planning, and ultimately designing the long-term solutions.
Understandably, as the tidal basin is at sea level, we asked about climate change and sea level rise, and if that would be taken into consideration by the engineers and architects.
Absolutely. Not only what's happening now, but again, we want to make sure this site is sustainable for the long term. So also, what are future impacts going to be? So, hydrology is definitely going to be part of the mix here, and understanding, again, what's happening now, but also what we anticipate happening in the future and how we can prepare for that and mitigate it.
The Ideas Lab, funded with a $750,000 grant from the American Express Foundation, will be up and running later this year, with its proposals expected about a year from now. It sounds like a rich and robust initiative that will produce some very exciting proposals.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Dry Tortugas National Park, 70 miles from Key West, just very well might be the most remote national park in the lower 48. But when you arrive, you're surrounded by crystalline waters for snorkeling, kayaking, and relaxing on pristine beaches. There are sunken wrecks to explore, coral reefs swarming with colorful marine life, and history in the brick walls of a Civil War-era fort. The Yankee Freedom 3, departing from Key West, can get you there in a little more than 2 hours. Visit them at drytortugas.com.
When someone says the word Alabama, what do you imagine? For most, I'm guessing the melody of Sweet Home Alabama pops into your head, or scenes from the movie by the same name. For me, most of what I picture actually stems from a television show, Heart of Dixie, which centers around a young doctor moving to the state in search of a mysterious father. Not exactly based on reality. What I didn't know until I moved into the next-door Florida Panhandle was that Alabama is an ecologically diverse, beautiful state stretching from sugar sand coastline to the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. During a 5-day break from my usual work and graduate school studies, my husband and I came up with an ambitious plan: visit all 5 of Alabama's national park sites in a single week. The first, Little River Canyon National Preserve. That sound you hear is the giant waterfall. Designated in 1992, the preserve was, quote, established to protect and preserve the natural, scenic, recreational, and cultural resources of the area, and to provide for public enjoyment of those resources. The canyon itself, where we stood to look at the waterfall, is the most dramatic element of the park unit, in some places falling nearly 500 feet to the edge of the river below. Some people even rock climb here, and the waterway is known for its fishing opportunities, but we didn't opt for climbing or fishing. It was hiking that we sought. Most start their explorations of the park at Little River Falls, and we proved no exception. The moment I shut the door to the car, I could hear the rushing water pounding on the rocks below, the white froth of the falls itself peeking through the swath of forest separating the parking area from the viewing platform. So everyone loves waterfalls, but I just have to pause for one moment here to explain why I love waterfalls so much. While my current home state is absolutely gorgeous, full of beaches and pine forests and palm trees, Florida is so flat. So flat. In fact, ravines that are only 100 feet deep are carefully protected within state parks or lauded for their dramatic topography. Sure, we have a few waterfalls. There's even a state park named after a waterfall, but they are nowhere near the size and strength of Little River Falls. We actually watched the water for a long time, snapping photos to send to our friends and relatives. But the hiking trails called, and we traced the edge of the canyon before picking our way down to the rock-lined river below. We've made our way down to the edge of the river, and it's basically sheer cliffs going straight up in 2 directions. These giant boulders have fallen into the river and kind of are juxtaposed with the shoreline. And it's a little breezy, but every time the sun comes out, the water turns from this deep, deep greenish brown to bright blue and emerald. It's really amazing. The boulders looked huge, sitting in giant piles like mini mountains, oblong shapes and sizes adding to the complexity of the riverbed itself. By the time we made it to the river's edge, the sun began to shine in earnest, and every time its rays escaped the prevailing cloud cover, the water would turn this crazy, brilliant blue-green, perfectly clear and shimmering in the noontime light. My husband is an avid angler. He's actually obsessed with fishing, and I would put his love of breathing just below his love of fishing. Already he began to talk of a return trip, of the flies he would cast, the equipment he would bring, all to target the rare red-eye bass. Luckily, from our vantage point, we actually couldn't see any silhouettes of swimming fish, even with our polarized sunglasses. And I say luckily because I'm pretty sure if he spotted one, I would be watching the spot while he went to the nearest gear and tackle store. Originally, we planned to drive the Overlook Road, stopping at different pull-offs to take in the river from above. However, in the end, we couldn't pull ourselves away from the edge of the rushing water, preferring to bask in the warmth of the rocks before eventually hiking back up to our car. I may see emerald hues in the Gulf of Mexico near my home, but I felt a special magic observing the color in a freshwater river, like nearby fairies had dusted the stream bed with an elixir. For those looking to make the visit themselves, stop at the visitor center first for a map, a stamp, and helpful directions from one of the rangers, and prepare to spend a lot of time just looking at the water.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. For National Parks Traveler, this is Kurt Repanshek. See you in the parks.
The North Cascades Institute has a large portfolio. It is an environmental learning center, training center, conference center, and leadership center, all set in the splendor of the North Cascades National Park Complex. Learn more at ncascades.org. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to deepen the public's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling national park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcast. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.